لنتحقق بوقعته
لترشيح عماد ميشيل عون.
المعارضة السورية هي اللي تحدد من يمثلها.
Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Lina Tamim, and these are today's headlines. The trial of former Information Minister Michel Smeha is adjourned until February 18th. Speaking at the London Donors Conference in London, Prime Minister Tamam Islam appeals for international help to handle the financial burden of the Syrian refugee crisis. And nearly 40,000 civilians from Syria flee a regime offensive near Aleppo as world leaders meeting in London voice concern at the huge number of refugees fleeing the army's offensive. The trial of former Information Minister Michel Smeha was adjourned until February 18th. Head of the military court, Judge Tony Latouf, continued to ask Smeha questions regarding phone calls with undercover police informant Milad Gfouri. The defendant reiterated his doubts that the informant would have been able to carry out a plot against clerics and officials in North Lebanon. He reportedly contradicted his statements several times in court. During the last sessions held on January 21st, Smeha confessed to transporting explosives from Syria in his car and cooperating with Gfouri to plan acts of terrorism. Military examining magistrate Judge Fadi Sawan has issued an indictment against a Syrian and 5 Lebanese nationals suspected of belonging to a terrorist organization. The national news agency says Sawan indicted the 6 suspects who are in custody on charges of belonging to an armed terrorist group for the purpose of carrying out terrorist activities and killing soldiers. The judge also charged them with the attempted murder of troops and the possession of arms and explosives. The suspects were referred to the permanent military court for trial. Syria's army and its allies have broken a 3-year rebel siege of 2 Shia towns in northwest Syria, cutting off a main supply route to nearby Turkey. The breakthrough comes after days of rapid military gains north of the major city of Aleppo, with Russian airstrikes playing a key role in the advance. Nearly 40,000 Syrian civilians have fled the regime bombardments in the area. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says he has had a robust conversation with Russia after Syria talks halted in Geneva because of Russian-backed airstrikes in Aleppo.
Been discussing this morning ways in which we, as a group of like-minded countries, can support the parties to that dialogue, to enable them to keep talking in what are very difficult circumstances. We recognise that it's difficult for the regime to be at the table talking to the opposition. It's difficult for the opposition to talk to the regime when their people at home are being killed through bombing and other forms of attack. But we have to continue with this process because it is the only way to get a solution to the disaster that is engulfing Syria. John.
Also, paragraph 13 demands that all parties immediately cease any attacks against civilians and civilian objects as such, including attacks against medical facilities and personnel, and any indiscriminate use of weapons, including through shelling and aerial bombardment. It could not be more clear. That is an obligation that is not tied to talks. It is an obligation accepted by all parties in the United Nations resolution. Russia voted for that. Russia has a responsibility, as do all parties, to live up to it. So I had a conversation this morning with Foreign Minister Lavrov. We discussed, and he agreed that we need to discuss how to implement ceasefire and also how to get access by both parties. The opposition needs to allow access for humanitarian assistance, and the regime in Syria needs to allow access.
British Prime Minister David Cameron has opened a Syria donors conference in London, saying there was a critical shortfall in life-saving aid for the war-wracked country. The conference is aiming to raise $9 billion in aid for Syrian people displaced by 5 years of civil war. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged a return to the negotiating table after UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, announced a 3-week pause in the Geneva talks.
And if ever there was a moment to take a new approach to the humanitarian crisis in Syria, surely it is now. We are facing a critical shortfall in life-saving aid that is fatally holding back our humanitarian efforts. And after years of conflict, we are witnessing a desperate movement of humanity as hundreds of thousands of Syrians fear they have no alternative than to put their lives in the hands of evil people smugglers in search of a future.
It is deeply disturbing that the initial steps of the talks have been undermined by the continuous lack of sufficient humanitarian access and by a sudden increase of aerial bombings and military activities within Syria. The focus on the people of Syria is also being lost amid petty procedural matters. The coming days should be used to get back to the table, not to secure more gains on the battlefield.
Prime Minister Tamam Salam says Lebanon is not able to handle the financial burden of the Syrian refugee crisis on its own. Speaking at the London Donors Conference, Salam appealed to the international community for help, saying the annual humanitarian aid was not enough and expressed hope that the donors' pledges will produce what he called tangible results. The PM earlier said he will be asking for around $11 billion to help the country deal with the refugee crisis. Salam also said the presence of Syrian refugees in Lebanon should be temporary. In fact, the Lebanese delegation in London is expected to reveal a new project aimed at enabling the return of Syrian refugees to their country once peace prevails. And for her part, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says her country will give 2.3 billion euros in aid to Syria by 2018, including 1.1 billion euros this year alone. Merkel, who was also speaking at the donor conference in London, said approximately a quarter of that amount should go to the World Health Organization. The United States later added another $890 million to the Syrian humanitarian aid effort, pledging increased support for refugee aid. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said $600 million in new funding would go on urgent aid to refugees and beleaguered populations in and around Syria. Another $290 million will go on development assistance for schooling for refugee children in Jordan and Lebanon. U.S. President Barack Obama makes his first visit ever to a U.S. mosque. More details coming up next. Welcome back. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange says he will respect a UN ruling on his case and accept arrest by British authorities at noon on Friday if it goes against him. UK police earlier said that plans to take Assange into custody on an outstanding arrest warrant were still in place. Assange, an Australian national, has been sought by Swedish authorities since 2012 for questioning over allegations of rape. U.S. President Barack Obama has made his first visit to a U.S. mosque and condemned inexcusable political rhetoric against Muslim Americans amid a growing number of hate crimes being committed against members of the country's Muslim community. Obama said extremists were hungry for legitimacy as they commit acts of violence around the world. In his words.
Well, I agree we actually do need moral clarity. Let's have some moral clarity. Groups like ISIL are desperate for legitimacy. They try to portray themselves as religious leaders and holy warriors who speak for Islam. I refuse to give them legitimacy. We must never give them that legitimacy. They're not defending Islam. They're not defending Muslims. The vast majority of the people they kill are innocent Muslim men, women, and children. And by the way, the notion that America's at war with Islam ignores the fact that the world's religions are a part of who we are. We can't be at war with any other religion because the world's religions are a part of the very fabric of the United States, our national character. So the best way for us to fight terrorism is to deny these organizations legitimacy and to show that here in the United States of America we do not suppress Islam. We celebrate and lift up the success of Muslim Americans. That's how we show the lie that they're trying to propagate. we shouldn't play into terrorist propaganda, even as the overwhelming majority, and I repeat, the overwhelming majority of the world's Muslims embrace Islam as a source of peace. It is undeniable that a small fraction of Muslims propagate a perverted interpretation of Islam. This is the truth. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, they're not the first extremists in history to misuse God's name. We've seen it before across faiths. Part of what we have to do is to lift up the contributions of the Muslim American community. If you're ever wondering whether you fit in here, let me say it as clearly as I can. As President of the United States, you fit in here, right here. You're right where you belong. You're part of America too. You're not Muslim or American, you're Muslim and American. And don't grow cynical. Don't respond to ignorance by embracing a worldview that suggests you must choose between your faith and your patriotism. If we're serious about freedom of religion, and I'm speaking now to my fellow Christians who remain the majority in this country, we have to understand, an attack on one faith is an attack on all our faiths.
U.S. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump has accused rival Ted Cruz of stealing a victory in the Iowa caucuses during a rally in Little Rock, Arkansas. Cruz and Trump are going head-to-head for voters in New Hampshire, where Cruz's evangelical Christian credentials will not likely be as helpful as they were in Iowa.
Oh, that voter fraud. You know, these politicians are brutal. They're brutal. They are brutal. They are a bunch of dishonest cookies, I want to tell you. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this. It's one of the reasons. They send out an application, and it looks like it's sent by the government, and it says voter violation on the top. And it looks just like it came from the IRS, okay? Voter violation, and then it has all sorts of problems, and then it says go vote for this guy. And I said, man, that's like a fraud. And then they have, as you know, Ben Carson, a good guy, very good guy. They said Ben Carson's essentially left the race, vote for the guy, right? I said, how can they do that? And everybody said, how can they do that? And then he doesn't get the votes, Ben, but Ted gets the votes. And you say, give me a break. And then the pollster said, well, I told you I was right because they had us up 5%. This political stuff is dangerous, and these political people are really, really dishonest. Really dishonest. So let's see where it goes. My focus is on New Hampshire. I have to say we're doing great up there. The people in New Hampshire are great. People in Arkansas are great. I have to tell you this. I'll tell you what. The people of this country are great. You want to know the truth? The people of our country are great. And we don't need a president who was born in Canada. Do we agree?
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. The trial of former Information Minister Michel Smeha is adjourned until February 18. Speaking at the London Donors Conference, Prime Minister Tamam Slam appeals for international help to handle the financial burden of the Syrian refugee crisis. And nearly 40,000 Syrians flee a regime offensive near Aleppo as world leaders meeting in London voiced concern at the huge numbers fleeing the army's offensive. Those are your top stories for today. I'm Linda Tamim, and I thank you all for watching.
لترشيح عماد ميشيل عون.
المعارضة السورية هي اللي تحدد من يمثلها.